In this video, we're going to look at economic growth and get a better understanding of why some countries are rich and others are poor. We can start by looking historically at the human condition. And for most of the history of humankind, going back 300,000 years, we lived at a basic subsistence level. Anytime you got something to eat, that was enough to keep you alive for another day or two, and that was it. And it wasn't until the agricultural revolution about 10 to 12,000 years ago that we see just a slight blip up, going from about $1 to $1.50 a day up to $3 to $5 a day in consumption. And again, that goes on for another 10,000 years until only about 1800, and then you can see that big rise in the living standards for many parts of the country, not all. And so we can see that it didn't happen everywhere. We see North America, excluding Mexico, Western Europe, Australia, parts of East Asia. And here we see China, beginning about 1980, 1990, it starts taking off, raising living standards considerably. And so by country, we can see that the average of $1.50 to $3 per day following the agricultural revolution hasn't changed all that much for some places. But for many it has. For most, again, North America, excluding Mexico, Western Europe, Australia, East Asia, those countries are doing well, but there's still many who are consuming a very basic subsistence lifestyle or not much better than that. India's average may be $5.99 a day, but again, it's a 1.3 billion population. There are a lot of people who are living well below that $5.99 a day. And again, this tells us nothing about that distribution, and we do want to know that. We'll see a little bit about that. But we want to see that many people are still living on $2 a day or less. It's fallen considerably, as we'll see in the next graph. But there are some countries that are actually very, very wealthy. The United States, for example, and others that are very, very poor. India, many parts of Africa. And so the $1.90 a day, again, since 1990, the percentage of the world's population living in this extreme poverty has declined considerably, and that's mostly because of what's going on in China. So again, we saw that roughly 44% lived on less than less than $1.90 a day, but since 1990, that's gone down considerably to less than 10%. However, even today, 85% of the world's population lives on less than $30 per day, which is about $11,000 per year. Compare that to the United States, where the per capita income is around $60,000. So the question is, why is it we can put a man on the moon but not eradicate world hunger and poverty? And do we just not care about the poor? Some would argue that's the case, but that's not the case at all. What we're dealing with is a complicated problem versus a complex problem. Putting a man on the moon is a complicated problem. We need to solve some basic fundamental equations dealing with the thrust of a rocket, the gravitational pull of the Earth, the orbiting of the Earth and the atmosphere, what's happening with the rocket. That's a complex or a complicated problem. That can be solved mathematically. This equation here is Mahalanobis's equation of a macroeconomy, as if it's a complicated problem. But eradicating world hunger and poverty is a complex problem. We're not going to be able to eradicate that through mathematical formulas. What causes poverty? That's a very common question that people ask. A common refrain is that lack of money. But lack of money is the definition of poverty. To say that lack of money causes poverty is like saying being overweight is what causes obesity. You've defined it, you've not said what's caused it. So what causes poverty is really the wrong question. The answer is nothing causes poverty. That's the state of humankind. That's what we were born into. So really the bigger question is, what causes economic growth? Why did the vast wealth we see in the world today only happen in a few, last 200 years, and only in some nations and not others? Some will argue about poverty that's a lack of natural resources. However, we can look at comparable countries and see that's not the case. North Korea, that's all lit up in the bottom half of that, right in the middle of that map, is very, very productive, has a high per capita GDP, and North Korea has got very poor GDP, per capita GDP, and they share a common border. The United States and Mexico is another example. So lack of natural resources doesn't really explain this. One would say too many people, population density. But this is Hong Kong. It's one of the most densely populated areas, and it had been one of the richest areas, one of the highest per capita income countries. So that's hard to explain it through population density. Low levels of human capital. People in India or Mexico are not really bright. They're not hardworking. but that's not the case at all. You move somebody from those countries to the United States, their productivity increases dramatically. So their level of productivity in their home country might be low, but it's not because of them. Move them to another country, it's very, very high. Low savings rates. This is a common argument. We'll look at the Solow growth model a little bit. However, the United States is a traditionally low savings country. Now, part of that's the way we define GDP, but we still have a pretty low savings rate. And lastly, is a lack of democracy. And yet again, India is one of the world's largest democracies, and yet it's one of the world's poorest countries. So when we think of economic growth, we want to look at some different things. One thing we'll look at is the Malthusian Trap. Thomas Malthus argued that the population would grow more rapidly than the food source, and therefore the population would starve. So if we look at per capita GDP, is GDP divided by the population, well, we can look at the percentage change in GDP as the percentage change in output minus the percentage change in the population. And as long as Y increases faster than population, then per capita GDP will increase. But if the increase in the population increases more rapidly than the increase in GDP, then we're going to have a catastrophe. And this is what Malthus argued. As we can see, the green line would be the linear growth of resources, and the red line shows the exponential increase in population, eventually becoming so great that there's a huge decline and people dying off. And of course, that's not what happened. Yet Malthus still lives. There are doom and gloomers that still persist today. Here is Malthus making his comment in 1798, and yet here's the Club of Rome in 1972. But even still, we have someone like Paul Ehrlich who was making that claim back in 1980. Still today argues that the population is the world cannot sustain the population. And so this is why also some people are cautiously skeptical of global warming alarmists. There tends to be a lot of money in people who can raise these alarms and argue that things are going bad and things are going to be worse. However, we don't see that happening. It was Julian Simon who came up with the best bet with Paul Ehrlich and said, if you're right, then resources will become more costly. You pick any five, and I'll bet you the price had fallen. And Julian Simon won. And his basic point is that more people increases our aggregate knowledge, and our aggregate knowledge is what helps us solve problems. And so we are still increasing in population size, and yet we are still becoming wealthier. We also have Norman Borlaug in the Green Revolution. This man by himself is responsible for pulling billions of people out of poverty or starvation simply by understanding better ways of farming and getting more crop yields. And so we find better ways of producing and moving forward. So Julian Simon's argument is actually very, very important. Norman Borlaug's work has been very important. And so what really matters? Simon here argues that what really matters is the economic freedom. Well, we do find this is the case. If we look at what causes growth, Paul Romer, who devised the endogenous growth models, argued that what really matters is people, machines, and rules. And we can see that we need more people to produce. Machines, countries with more capital per worker have higher rates of growth. That's shown in this map. And then rules. And Romer argues that people can move anywhere in the world. Machines can be moved pretty much anywhere they need to be. What really matters, why are some countries rich and others are poor, are the rules. Countries that have better rules have higher rates of economic growth. Well, what are those rules? Well, we have formal legal rules, property rights. If I'm not secure in my property rights, I'm not going to invest long term. I'm going to do short-term investment. We're going to have spot exchanges. So having secure property rights gives people the incentive to invest. It also gives the incentive for people to internalize the costs and benefits of their actions. Contract enforcement. When people know that other people are going to follow through with their promises, then you have longer-term contracting. And so we have to have a good way of enforcing contracts. Rule of law. Laws apply to everybody equally. Politicians or anybody else, big businesses, moneyed interests, do not get away with things that somebody else doesn't. This isn't always working perfectly, but the idea of the rule of law is very important, that the laws are known and people abide by them and they're enforced on everybody equally. Stable political institutions. If you look at some countries, there are a lot of instability in their political institutions. and therefore there's no way to have economic growth because of that uncertainty. So having a stable political institution is very important. Sound money, not having high rates of inflation or hyperinflation, which destroys wealth. And last one is open and competitive markets. You need to have people competing, trying to better the lives of other people, providing more value than what anybody else is doing. These are the formal legal rules, but we also need to understand the informal or the non-legal rules. And some of them just luck. The planned order versus the emergent order, 300,000 years, and there are plenty of mistakes, but as we learn from these mistakes, we move on. Well, some countries adapted to their mistakes better than others. Part of that's just plain luck. Culture is a main thing. We adhere to socially acceptable rules of behavior. It's not that I'm afraid of being arrested if I ignore or defy somebody's property rights. I respect other people's property rights, and that's part of our culture, and that's a real important thing to do. Other socially acceptable rules of behavior, these are very, very essential, that we know we live in a world, a complex world, and understanding how to navigate that means that there are rules and norms that people pay attention to, and that we know what to expect from them, and that's part of culture. History and path dependence, sometimes it's just hard to break away from a bad equilibrium, and this leaves some countries mired in poverty. So path dependence can have a long-term effect. And this is the end. We'll move on to part 2, which is the Solow growth model.